The box slipped first, and the bowl inside it went second, and I heard the crack before I felt it land in my chest. It was my mother's mixing bowl. Cream-colored ceramic, chipped at the rim from 30 years of use. The only thing of hers I'd carried up 4 flights of stairs instead of shipping, because I didn't trust movers with it. Now it sat on the hallway tile in 2 clean halves, a hairline fracture running through the glaze like a river on a map, and I was on my knees in front of a stranger's open door at 8 in the morning, trying to remember how to breathe. "You're bleeding," the stranger said. I looked up. She was tall in the specific way that made door frames look smaller. Dark hair pulled back hard enough to read as armor, and she was looking at my hand instead of my face. I looked down. A shard had opened a thin line across my palm, and I hadn't noticed, which told me something true about the last 6 months of my life. I had gotten very good at not noticing what hurt. "It's fine," I said. "It's just a bowl." "It's not fine. You're getting blood on the grout." She crouched, picked up both halves of the bowl with a care I didn't expect from someone built like a closed fist, and set them on the little table by her door. "I'm Sloane. You're the new roommate." "Mari," I said. "Marigold, nobody uses the whole thing." "I might," she said, and went to get a towel, and that was the entire conversation. And somehow, it was already more attention than I'd gotten from another living person in a week. I had not planned to be 26 and splitting a 2-bedroom with a woman I met on a listing site 3 days after my old roommate cleared out our joint account and left a note that said sorry, needed a fresh start on the kitchen counter. I had not planned any of the last year. Honestly, I had planned culinary school, a stage under a real chef, my name on a menu somewhere. What I had instead was a job at the Copper Spoon, 6 shifts a week under a man named Denny Pruitt, who called me filler cook to the line and took my recipes to the pass with his own name in his mouth. And a mother 2 states away whose treatments cost more than I made in a month, and a mixing bowl that used to be whole. Sloane came back with a first aid kit that looked like it belonged in a field hospital, not an apartment, and wrapped my hand without asking permission, which should have annoyed me and instead made something in my chest go quiet for the first time in days. Her hands were exact, efficient. She smelled like black tea steeped too long and rain on cold slate, a scent so precise it felt deliberate, like even her body had been trained not to waste anything, and under it I caught the faintest thread of alpha musk, banked low, controlled. She caught me catching it. Her jaw tightened a fraction. "I keep to myself," she said, like a warning label. "Rents due the first. I don't do group dinners, I don't do keys under the mat, and I don't explain myself twice." "Noted," I said. "I don't do mornings, I burn toast on a professional level, and I apparently drop things." Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, the ghost of the idea of one. "Then we'll get along fine," she said, "as long as you keep the disasters confined to your side of the kitchen." I didn't know yet that disaster would become the only nickname anyone had ever given me that I wanted to keep. I glued the bowl back together that night at the kitchen table, and Sloane watched from the doorway with her arms crossed like she was supervising a structural repair, and didn't offer to help, and didn't leave either. When I finally set it down, seam bisecting the glaze, she said, "It'll hold." Cracked things do, if you're patient with the glue, and went to bed before I could decide whether she meant the bowl. The friction started small, the way it always does. She alphabetized the spice rack while I was at work, and I found it and rearranged it by how often I used things, and the next morning it was alphabetized again, and neither of us said a word about it, which was somehow louder than fighting. She left a container of soup on the counter the night I came home from a double with flour still in my hair and shift blister on my heel. No note, just soup, still warm, like she'd timed it to my train. I asked her about it, and she said she'd made too much, which was a lie, because I never saw her cook for herself again after that. The building had a doorman who called her Miss Vane, and I thought nothing of it, because plenty of buildings gave staff a formal surname, and I was busy noticing other things. The way she never let takeout menus pile on the counter, like she couldn't stand loose ends. The calls she took on the balcony with the door shut, voice dropping into a register I never heard indoors. The security man in the lobby who nodded at her like she was inspecting his post instead of walking past it. 3 weeks in, the city lost power in the worst storm of the year, and the hallway went black, and I heard her moving toward my door before I heard the knock. "You don't like the dark," she said. Not a question. I hadn't told her that. "How did you leave the bathroom light on every night?" A pause, and in it I could hear the storm testing the windows. "Come sit with me. I have candles, and I know where the good blanket is." We sat on her floor because her couch, I learned, was for looking at and not for using, and the candlelight did something unfair to her face, softened the sharp architecture of it until she looked less like a fortress and more like a person who had simply built one around herself. She actually talked, about a dog she'd had as a kid and lost too early. And I talked about my mother's hands when she used to teach me to fold dough, and somewhere in the 3rd hour the space between us on the floor had closed to nothing, and the storm cracked once, hard, right over the building, and I flinched into her shoulder without deciding to. She didn't move away. "Mari," she said low, and it wasn't a question either. It was a door opening. I don't remember which of us closed the last inch. I remember her mouth was warm and careful and asked before it took, the way her hands had been that first morning, and I remember thinking, distantly, that I had never in my life been kissed like I was something that might crack if handled wrong and was worth the caution anyway. I remember the candle guttering out some time after. I remember, less clearly, falling asleep against her shoulder with the storm still murmuring outside, safe in a way I hadn't let myself be in longer than I could count. What I remember with total, humiliating clarity is waking up alone on her floor at 6 a.m. with the power back on, and her already dressed in a suit that cost more than my rent, standing in the kitchen like she'd never sat on the ground in her life. "That was a mistake," she said, before I'd found any words at all. "It shouldn't have happened. Sloan, I don't do that. Flat, final, the fortress, fully rebuilt, every stone back in place. I think it's better if we're clear about that going forward." I looked at her and I thought about the soup she'd lied about making too much of, and the way she'd wrapped a stranger's bleeding hand like it mattered, and I said the only thing my pride had left in the tank. "Sure," I said. "Never happened." She nodded once, like a transaction closing, and left for work 40 minutes early, and I sat at the kitchen table across from my mother's mended bowl and thought, not for the first time, that I had a talent for loving things that broke in my hands. The next weeks ran on a truce built entirely out of avoidance. Sloan left before I woke and came home after I'd gone to bed, and the apartment got quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the storm being over. Josie noticed it first. Because Josie noticed everything, she showed up at the Copper Spoon on my break with 2 coffees and a look that meant I wasn't getting out of the conversation. "You kissed the Ice Queen," she said, without preamble, "and now you're both pretending to be furniture." "This is not a functioning strategy, Mari," she said. It was a mistake. "Did it feel like a mistake? Josie, that's not a no." She sipped her coffee, watching me over the rim with the particular smugness of a beta who has never once in her life been afraid of an alpha. "For what it's worth, my cousin does catering for some of the fancy hotel galas downtown, and she swears she saw your roommate at one, in a receiving line, being called Miss Kestrel like it was a title." "You sure her last name's Vane?" I told her she had to be thinking of someone else, because Sloane clipped coupons. Sloane wore the same 3 sweaters on rotation. Sloane once spent 20 minutes arguing with a self-checkout machine over a produce code. That was not a woman with a receiving line. I believed that until the night I came home to find a tabloid clipping face down on the counter that Sloane had clearly meant to throw away and hadn't quite managed, and turned it over out of nothing but habit. And found a photograph of her in a black dress under a headline that read The Kestrel Returns. Hospitality heir breaks 5-year silence on family empire, and under it, in smaller print, her full name. Sloane Adeline Kestrel. CEO, Kestrel Hospitality Group. 61 hotels. A press nickname that made board members go quiet in meetings. My roommate, who alphabetized spices and lied about leftover soup, was the Kestrel. I was still holding the clipping when her key turned in the lock. "You could have told me," I said before she'd even set her bag down, and watched her whole body go still in the doorway the way prey goes still, except she was nobody's prey. She was the thing everyone else went still around. "It never came up," she said. "It never came up." I laughed, and it came out uglier than I meant it to. "You watched me apologize for burning your kettle. You watched me count exact change at the grocery store. And the whole time you owned the building we live in, didn't you?" Yes, just that. No cushioning. No apology dressed up as explanation, and something about the honesty of it, brutal and unadorned, hurt worse than a lie would have, because it meant she hadn't even thought I was owed the softer version. "Why?" I said, and my voice cracked on the single syllable. "Does everyone in my life get to decide what I don't need to know?" She didn't answer that. She looked, for one unguarded second, like someone had asked her a question in a language she used to speak and had spent years forgetting on purpose. Then the fortress came back up, brick by brick, and she said, "I have an early call," and went to her room, and I stood in the kitchen holding a photograph of a stranger who used to sit with me on the floor during storms. 3 days later, Denny Pruitt fired me. He did it in front of the whole line, which was its own kind of message, holding up a plate of the lavender honey tart I developed on my own time, the one that had been quietly saving the Copper Spoon's dessert reviews for 2 months running. "Recipes inconsistent," he said, loud enough for the dish room to hear. "Can't have that kind of unreliability on my menu." He did not mention that he'd put his own name on that tart in the press release. He did not mention the 12-hour shifts I'd covered when his daughter was sick. He fired me over a dessert I had built out of a memory of my mother's kitchen, and the whole line watched me untie my apron and say nothing. Because there was nothing left in me to say. I walked the 40 minutes home instead of taking the train, because I needed the cold on my face, and by the time I got to the apartment, I was crying in the specific, exhausted way that isn't about any one thing anymore. It's about all of them at once. My mother's bills, the bowl, the kiss that never happened, the job that just ended over a dessert nobody bothered to ask my name for. Sloane was home. She took one look at me in the doorway, and every ounce of the fortress fell away so fast, it was like watching a building implode on purpose. "What happened?" she said, already crossing the room, already reaching for me, and then stopping herself an inch short, hand hovering. "Tell me what happened. You don't have to pretend to care," I said, which was cruel, and I knew it was cruel while I said it, and I said it anyway, because I was bleeding and she was the nearest thing to blame. "I'm not pretending." Her voice cracked on the word pretending, the first crack I'd ever heard in it. "I have never once pretended with you. That's the problem. That's the whole problem, Mari. I have never been anything but exactly myself with you, and it terrifies me." "Then why did you say it never happened?" "Because if it happened, she said. Then it was real, and I don't know what to do with things that are real. I know what to do with hotels. I know what to do with boards and enemies and hostile buyouts. I have never once known what to do with someone who looks at me like I'm not a headline. I stood there with my coat still on, tears drying cold on my face, and something in me that had been braced for a fight simply stopped bracing. "Tell me to stop," she said, stepping into the last inch of space between us, "and I will. I need to hear you say it, one way or the other. I won't guess again. Don't stop," I said. She kissed me like she was rewriting the morning after the storm, slow and certain, one hand coming up to cradle my jaw like I might still be made of the same ceramic as that bowl, and this time when it ended, she didn't leave the room. "My mother used to say love was a liability audit," she said quietly, into the dark of the kitchen. Hours later, both of us sitting on the floor again, because apparently that was where we told each other the truth. She married my father because the merger made sense. I grew up watching two people share a house and a company and nothing else. When my sister bonded young, for love, her mate stayed exactly until the money got complicated and not one day longer. My whole family runs on one lesson. Anyone who wants you wants the kestrel name, so you make sure no one gets close enough to find out which one they wanted. "I didn't know your last name for a month," I said. "I fell for the woman who fights with self-checkout machines." "I know." Her voice was rough. "That's what scares me most." I told her about my mother then, about the diagnosis that ate our savings, one appointment at a time, about walking out of culinary school in my second year because tuition and treatment couldn't both exist in the same bank account, about learning to taste a dish once and rebuild it whole because it was the only kind of genius that didn't cost anything to keep. She listened with her whole body angled toward me, the way no one had listened to me in longer than I wanted to admit. And when I was done, she pressed her mouth to my temple and said nothing at all, because some things don't need an answer, they need a witness. We might have stayed on that floor until morning if her phone hadn't lit up at 11 with Odette March's name, 3 missed calls deep, and one text underneath that made Sloane go very still. "Desmond's called an emergency board session. He's saying you're compromised. Call me now." I didn't know yet what compromised meant, in the language of boardrooms and family money. I found out 4 days later when my picture ran under a headline calling me a gold-digging line cook who'd wormed her way into the Kestrel penthouse next to a grainy photo of me and Sloane on the sidewalk that had been taken, I would later learn, from a car parked outside our building for 6 straight days. Desmond Kestrel had never liked me. Not that I'd given him more than one dinner's worth of reason to. He was Sloane's cousin, second on the board, the kind of man who called me the roommate's little project to my face and smiled while he did it. What I didn't know, sitting in Sloane's kitchen, reading my own name, turned into a punchline by people who'd never met me, was that Desmond had spent the last 2 years quietly draining the Kestrel Family Foundation's charity accounts, and that the fastest way to keep anyone from looking too closely at the books was to make sure the person closest to Sloane looked like the only scandal in the room. "I have to distance myself," Sloane said, not meeting my eyes, legal counsel's voicemail still open on her phone, publicly until the board session clears. "It's optics, it's not. It's exactly what you did the morning after the storm," I said. "You're doing it again. You're just doing it out loud this time, in front of everyone." "Mari, I always land on my feet," I said, which was the thing I told myself every time the ground gave out, and I said it now like an incantation, packing my overnight bag with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, because I recognized this particular shape of goodbye, and I was not going to wait around to watch her build the wall a third time. I stayed with Josie for a week. On the fourth night, when Theo from the flower stall 2 doors down from the Copper Spoon texted to ask if I wanted to get dinner, no agenda, just company, I said yes. Because I was tired of being someone's liability audit, and because Theo had never once made me feel like a headline. It was a good dinner. Easy, he asked about my mother and actually remembered the answer. He laughed at my burnt toast jokes. Nothing about it made my chest do the thing Sloane's voice did on the other side of a door. Sloane found out within a day, because apparently the whole building had opinions about my life, and when I came home to grab the rest of my things, she was standing in the kitchen with a stillness that had nothing calm underneath it. "You went to dinner with someone," she said. I did. Was it good? It was fine, Sloane. He's kind. He doesn't disappear the morning after. Something flickered across her face, fast and unguarded, gone before I could name it, except that I recognized it, because I'd felt the same thing every time she pulled away. The particular, useless jealousy of watching someone choose safety over you and knowing you built the reason yourself. "I don't have the right to ask you not to," she said. Low, "No," I said. "You don't." I left with my bag, and she let me, and neither of those things felt like a victory. I took a temp shift the following week helping the catering staff at a Kestrel Foundation gala, because rent doesn't care about heartbreak, and Josie's couch has a spring in exactly the wrong place. I was counting inventory in a back office when I found the discrepancy. A supply order for 800 bottles of a vintage the guest list didn't remotely justify, billed to a shell vendor with an address that turned out, when I looked closer, to be a storage unit 3 blocks from Desmond Kestrel's condo. Numbers had always stuck to me the way flavors did, ever since I was 12 years old, balancing my mother's grocery ledger against her hospital bills at the kitchen table. I remembered every figure I'd ever needed to remember. These stuck harder than most, because they didn't add up, and because I finally understood exactly whose fingerprints were on the smear that had cost me my privacy, and nearly cost me the only person who'd ever wrapped my bleeding hand without asking permission first. I didn't call Sloane. I called Odette March. Odette had never liked me much, or hadn't seemed to, all clipped sentences and suspicious eyes across the one dinner I'd survived at Sloane's family table. She listened to my whole shaking account of shell vendors and storage units without interrupting once, and when I finished, she said, "In 9 years working for that woman, I have never seen her come home smiling. Not once. Then you moved in. A pause, waited, send me everything you have. And Mari, good work." It was the first time anyone at that table had used my actual name. 48 hours later, Odette had traced the shell vendor back through 3 more invoices, all of them signed off in board sessions Desmond had personally chaired, all of them timed to land while the board's attention was fixed on manufactured scandal instead of missing funds. Sloane, when she found out, did not go quiet the way she had over the tabloid photo. She went cold in an entirely different register. The register of a woman who has just understood exactly how her family's oldest lesson had been used as a weapon against the one person she'd let close enough to matter. She showed up at Josie's door at 10 at night, rain soaking through a coat that cost more than my old apartment's deposit, and didn't wait for an invitation before she said it. "I let them make you the story," she said. "I let a smear campaign built on my cousin's theft cost you your privacy, and I answered it by doing exactly what my mother would have done, which was protect the company and let the person who mattered take the damage. I am done doing what my mother would have done. Sloane, I'm not here to ask you to trust me again for free," she said. "I'm here because there's a gala in 3 days, the whole board will be in one room, and I would like you standing next to me when I take my cousin apart in front of all of them, not behind me, not distanced, Next to me. If you'll have me." Rain dripped off her jaw. She looked, for the first time since I'd known her, entirely undefended, no fortress left standing, and I understood that this soaked coat, no audience, nothing to gain and everything to lose by saying it out loud on a stranger's doorstep, was the truest thing she'd ever offered me. "Ask me with your words," I said, echoing her own rule back to her, because I needed to hear this one out loud, too. "I love you," Sloane said, like it cost her something, and she was paying it gladly. "I have loved you since you glued a broken bowl back together instead of throwing it away, and I have been a coward about it ever since. Come to the gala. Stand next to me. Let me finally do this in the light." The Kestrel Foundation Gala filled a ballroom with the kind of chandeliers that make ordinary people lower their voices, and I stood at the edge of it in a borrowed dress with my pulse in my throat, watching Sloane cross the floor toward the small stage like a woman walking into her own life for the first time. The dessert course, as it happened, had collapsed an hour earlier when the hired pastry team walked out over a payment dispute, and the event coordinator was one plated disaster away from a public catastrophe. I did not think about it. I simply walked into that kitchen, tied on a borrowed apron, and rebuilt, from a taste I'd carried in my memory for 11 years, the honeyed almond torte I remembered from a single bite at my mother's friend's wedding, the same torte, it turned out, that had once been Sloane's mother's signature dish before grief buried the recipe along with her. The room did not know that story when the plates went out. They only knew the torte was extraordinary, and by the time Sloane reached the microphone, half the ballroom was already asking who had made it. "Her name is Marigold Calder," Sloane said, before she said another word about her cousin, and she just made every caterer in this room obsolete with a recipe she rebuilt from memory. I'd like that on record before I say anything less pleasant. What came next was less pleasant, and precise and public. Odette played the recorded call in which Desmond had authorized the shell vendor, timed against the invoices, timed against the day the tabloid photograph ran. Desmond's face went the color of the tablecloths as security walked him out past a room full of people who had spent 2 years pretending to admire him. Nobody in that ballroom looked at me like a headline. They looked at me like the woman standing beside the Kestrel, which, as it turned out, was exactly who I was. Later, on the terrace, away from the last of the cameras, Sloane took both my hands in hers, careful the way she'd been with a bleeding palm on the worst morning of my old life. "Tell me to stop," she said, tilting my chin up, "and I will." "Don't stop," I said, for the second, and I understood now, the last time I would ever need to say it as a question. The bite, when it came, was gentle and certain, and asked for with her whole body before it was ever taken, and the bond settled into me like something that had always belonged there, warm where I'd been cold, sure where I'd been guessing. Black tea and rain-wet slate flooded warm through the space between us, and under it, for the first time, I caught something new in her scent. Not fear anymore, not armor. Just her, unguarded, glad. 6 months later, the Kestrel boardroom had a new face where Desmond's used to sit, his name struck from the Foundation's letterhead, and his trial date circled in red on Odette's calendar with what I can only describe as satisfaction. Denny Pruitt lost the Copper Spoon's biggest catering contract the week the gala photos ran. Once 3 separate food critics recognized the torte and asked, pointedly, why the chef of record had never mentioned Marigold Calder. I heard he's slinging diner food 2 towns over now, under someone else's name on the sign, which felt less like revenge and more like the universe finally getting the credits right. I opened my own bakery in the spring, small, on the ground floor of a building Sloane swears she had nothing to do with acquiring, though the rent is suspiciously reasonable. I named it The mended bowl, my mother's ceramic, seam and all, sits on a shelf behind the register where every customer can see the crack, because I stopped believing broken things needed to be hidden the day someone chose to sit with me through a storm instead of leaving. Theo came to the opening with his new partner, a florist 2 stalls down from his old one, and hugged me at the door like an old friend, because that's what he'd become, and no part of that felt like unfinished business. Odette showed up with a gift wrapped badly enough that I knew she'd wrapped it herself, a hand-thrown mixing bowl, glazed the same cream as my mother's, and said, gruffly, that in 9 years she had never seen Sloane wait for anyone the way she'd waited for me, and that she supposed that made me family now, so I'd better get used to being fussed over. Sloane still calls me disaster, some mornings when I burn the toast on principle just to hear her say it, and it has never once sounded like an insult since the night on the terrace when she said it instead like a vow. We were married in early spring, small, on the roof of the first hotel her mother ever built. Thread of black tea and rain-wet slate wrapped around spiced pear and brown sugar so completely that the officiant joked she'd never smelled 2 people more thoroughly bonded before she'd even finished the vows. Sloane's were 4 sentences long and undid me anyway. Mine ran longer, because I have never known how to be brief about anything I love. I still keep the mended bowl on the counter of our kitchen, cracked seam facing out, and some mornings the light comes through the window just right and catches the glue line like a vein of gold running through old ceramic, and Sloane stands behind me with her chin on my shoulder and says nothing at all. Because by now, we've learned some mornings don't need a single word. I used to think being unseen was just the shape of my life, the way some rooms are simply built without windows. I know better now. Being seen was never about being flawless. It was about someone finally staying long enough to notice the crack and choosing, on purpose, every ordinary morning after, to stay for the whole shape of me, mended, imperfect, and entirely hers. The end.